Following is a non-profit reading of a book. Please support the official release. Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. Brandon Sanderson, my bad. Sometimes I worry that I'm not the hero everyone thinks I am. The philosophers assure me that this is the time, that the signs have been met, but I still wonder if they have the wrong man. So many people depend on me. They say I will hold the future of the entire world in my arms. What would they think if they knew that their champion, the hero of ages, their savior, doubted himself? Perhaps they wouldn't be shocked at all. In a way, that is what worries me most. Maybe in their hearts they wonder, just as I do. When they see me, do they see a liar? Ash fell from the sky. Lord Trusting frowned, glancing up at the ruddy midday sky as his servant scuttled forward, opening a parasol over Trusting and his distinguished guest. Ashfalls weren't that uncommon in the final Empire, but Trusting had hoped to avoid getting soot stains on his fine new suit coat and red vest, which had just arrived via canal boat from Luthadel. Fortunately, there wasn't much wind. The parasol would likely be effective. Trusting stood with his guest on a small hilltop patio that overlooked the fields. Hundreds of people in brown smocks worked in the falling ash, caring for the crops. There was a sluggish effort in it, but of course that was the way of the Skaa. The peasants were an indolent, unproductive lot. They didn't complain, they knew better than that. Instead, they simply worked with bowed heads, moving about their work with quiet apathy. The passing whip of a taskmaster would force them into dedicated motion for a few moments. But as soon as the taskmaster moved on, they would return to their languor. Trusting turned to the man standing beside him on the hill. One would think, Trusting noted, that 1,000 years of working in the fields would have bred them to be a little more effective at it. The obligator turned, raising an eyebrow, the motion done as if to highlight his most distinctive feature, the intricate tattoos that laced the skin around his eyes. The tattoos were enormous, reaching all the way across his brow and up the sides of his nose. This was a full prelan, a very important obligator indeed. Trusting had his own personal obligators back at the manor, but they were only minor functionaries, with barely a few marks around their eyes. This man had arrived from Luthadel with the same boat that had brought Trusting's new suit. "You should see sitting, Skaa, Trusting," the obligator said, turning back to watch the Skaa workers. "These are actually quite diligent compared to those inside Luthadel. You have more direct control over your Skaa here. How many would you lose? You'd say you lose a month?" "Oh, half a dozen or so," Trusting said. "Some to beatings, some to exhaustions." "Runaways?" "Never," Trusting went. "When I first inherited this land from my father, I had a few runaways, but I executed their families. The rest quickly lost heart. I've never understood men who've had trouble with their Skaa. I find the creatures easy to control, if you show a properly firm hand." The obligator nodded, standing quietly in his grey robes. He seemed pleased, which was a good thing. The Skaa weren't actually Trusting's property. Like all Skaa, they belonged to the Lord Ruler. Trusting only leased the workers from his god, much in the same way he paid for the services of his obligators. The obligator looked down, checking his pocket watch, then glanced up at the sun. Despite the ashfall, the sun was bright this day, shining a brilliant crimson red behind the smoky blackness of the proper sky. Trusting moved a handkerchief and wiped his brow, thankful for the parasol's shade against this midday heat. Very well, Trusting, the obligator said. I will carry your proposal to Lord Venture as requested. He will have a favorable report from me on your operations here. Trusting held a sigh in relief. An obligator was required to witness any contract or business deal between noblemen. True, even a lowly obligator like the ones Trusting had engaged could serve as such a witness, but it meant so much more to impress Straff Venture's own obligator. The obligator turned toward him. I will have to leave down the canal this afternoon. So soon? Trusting asked. Wouldn't you care to stay for supper? No, the obligator replied. There is another matter I wish to discuss with you. I came not only at the behest of Lord Venture, but to look on some matters for the Canton of Inquisition. Rumors say that you like to dally with your ska women. Trusting felt a chill. The obligator smiled. He likely meant it to be disarming, but Trusting had only found it eerie. Don't worry yourself, Trusting, the obligator said. If there had been any real worries about your actions, a steel inquisitor would have been sent here in my place. Trusting nodded slowly. Inquisitor. He'd never seen one of the inhuman creatures, but he had heard stories. I have been merely satisfied regarding your reactions with the Ska woman, the obligator said, looking back over the field. What I've seen and heard here indicate that you always clean up your messes. A man such as you, efficient, productive, could go far in the Citadel. A few more years of work, some inspired mercantile deals, and who knows? The obligator turned away, and Trusting soon found himself smiling. It wasn't a promise, or even an endorsement. For the most part, that is. Obligators were more bureaucrats and witnesses than they were priests. But to hear such praise from one of the Lord Ruler's own servants, Trusting knew that had some nobility regarded the obligators as unsettling. Some even considered them a bother. But at that moment, Trusting could have kissed his distinguished guest. Trusting turned back toward the Ska, who worked quietly beneath the bloody sun and the lazy flakes of ash. Trusting had always been a country nobleman, living on his plantation, dreaming of perhaps moving onto Luthadel itself. He had heard of the balls and the parties, the glamour and the intrigue, and it excited him to no end. I'll have to celebrate tonight, he thought. There was that young girl in the 14th hovel that he had been watching for some time. He smiled again. A few more years of work, the obligator had said. But could Trusting perhaps speed that up if he worked a little harder? His Ska population had been growing lately. Perhaps if he pushed them a bit more, he could bring in an extra harvest this summer and fulfill his contract with Lord Venture in extra measure. Trusting nodded as he watched the crowd of lazy Ska, some working with their hoes, others on hands and knees, pushing the ash away from the fledgling crops. They didn't complain. They didn't hope. They barely dared to think. That was the way it should be, for they were Ska. There were... Trusting froze as one of the Ska looked up. The man met Trusting's eyes, a spark. No, a fire of defiance showing in his expression. Trusting had never seen anything like it, not in the face of a Ska. Trusting stepped backward reflexively, a chill running through him as the strange, straight-backed Ska held his eyes, and smiled. Trusting looked away. Sword on! He snapped. The burly taskmaster rushed up the incline. Yes, my lord. Trusting turned, pointing at... He frowned. Where had the Ska been standing? working with their heads bowed, bodies stained by soot and sweat. They were so hard to tell apart. Trusting paused, searching. He thought he knew the place, an empty spot. Nobody now stood. But no, that couldn't be it. The man couldn't have disappeared from the group so quickly. Where would he have gone? He must be in there somewhere, working with his head now properly bowed. Still, his moment of apparent defiance was inexcusable. "My lord?" Codon asked again. The obligator stood at the side, watching curiously. It would not be wise to let the man know that one of the Ska had acted so brazenly. "Work the Ska in that southern sector a little harder," Trusting ordered, pointing. "I see them being sluggish, even for Ska." "Beat a few of them." Cordon shrugged, but nodded. It wasn't much of a reason for a beating, but then he didn't need much of a reason to give the workers a beating. They were, after all, only Ska. Kelsier had heard stories. He had heard whispers of times when once, long ago, the sun had not been red. Times when the sky had been clogged by smoke and ash, when plants hadn't struggled to grow, and when Ska hadn't been slaves. Times before the Lord Ruler. However, those days were nearly forgotten. Even the legends were growing vague. Kelsier watched the sun, his eyes following the giant red disk as it crept towards the western horizon. He stood quietly for a long moment, alone in the empty fields. The day's work was done, the Ska had been herded back to their hovels, and soon the mist would come. Eventually, Kelsier sighed, then turned to pick his way across the furrows and pathways, weaving between large heaps of ash. He avoided stepping on the plants, though he wasn't sure why he bothered. The crops hardly seemed worth the effort. When, with wilted brown leaves, the plants seemed as depressed as the people who tended to them. The Ska hovels loomed in the waning light. Already Kelsier could see the mists beginning to form, clouding the air, and giving the mound-like buildings a surreal, intangible look. The hovel stood unguarded. There was no need for watchers, for no Ska would venture outside once night arrived. Their fear of the mists was far too strong. "I'll have to cure them of that someday," Kelsier thought, as he approached one of the larger buildings. "But all things in their own time." He pulled open the door and slipped inside. Conversation stopped immediately. Kelsier closed the door, then turned with a smile to confront the room of about 30 Ska. A fire pit burned weakly at the center, and the large cauldron inside it was filled with vegetable-dappled water, the beginnings of an evening meal. The soup would be bland, of course. Still, the smell was enticing. "Good evening, everyone," Kelsier said with a smile, resting his pack out beside his feet and leaning against the door. "How was your day?" His words broke the silence, and the women returned to their dinner preparations. A group of them sat in a crude table, continuing to regard Kelsier with dissatisfied expressions. "Our work was filled with work, traveler," said Tepper, one of the Ska elders. "Something you managed to avoid." Field work was never really suited me," Kelsier said. "It's far too hard on my delicate skin," he smiled, holding up hands and arms that were lined with layers and layers of thin scars. They covered his skin, running lengthwise, as if some beast had repeatedly raked its claws up and down his arms. Tepper snorted. He was supposed to be an elder, probably barely into his 40s. At most, he might be 5 years Kelsier's senior. However, the scrawny man held himself with the air of one who liked to be in charge. "There is no time for levity," Tepper said sternly. "When we harbor a traveler, we expected him to behave himself and avoid suspicion. When you ducked away from the fields this morning, you could have earned a whipping for the men around you. True, Kelsier said, but those men could have been whipped for standing in the wrong place, for pausing too long, or for coughing when a taskmaster walked by. I once saw a man beaten because his master claimed he had blinked inappropriately. Tepper sat with narrow eyes in a stiff posture, his arm resting on the table, his expression unyielding. Kelsier sighed, rolling his eyes. Fine, if you want me to go, I'll be off then. He slung his pack up on his shoulder and nonchalantly opened the door. Thick mist immediately began to pour through the portal, drifting lazily across Kelsier's body, pooling on the floor and creeping across the dirt like a hesitant animal. Several people gasped in horror, though most of them were too stunned to make a sound. Kelsier stood for a moment, staring out into the dark mists, their shifting currents lit feebly by the cooking pit's coals. Close the door. Tepper's words were a plea, not a command. Kelsier did as requested, pushing the door closed and stemming the flood of the white mist. The mist is not what you think. You fear it far too much. Men who venture into the mists lose their soul. A man whispered. Her words raised a question. Had Kelsier walked into the mist? What then had happened to his soul? If only you knew, Kelsier thought. Well, guess this means I'm staying. He waited for a boy to bring him a stool. It's a good thing, too. It would have been a shame for me to leave before I shared my news. More than one person perked up at the comment. This was the real reason they tolerated him. For the reason the timid peasants would harbor a man such as Kelsier, a Ska who defied the Lord Ruler's will by traveling from plantation to plantation. Renegade he may be, a danger to the entire community. But he brought news from the outside world. I come from the north, Kelsier said. From lands where the Lord's Ruler's touch is less noticeable. He spoke in a clear voice. The people leaned unconsciously toward him as they worked. On the next day, Kelsier's words would have repeated to the several hundred people who lived in other hovels. The Ska might be subservient, but they were incurable gossips. Local lords rule in the West, he said, and they are far from the iron grip of the Lord Ruler and his followers. Some of these distant noblemen find that happy Ska make better workers than mistreated Ska. One man, Lord Renault, has ordered his taskmasters to stop unauthorized beatings. There are whispers that he's considering paying wages to his plantation Ska, like city craftsmen might earn. Nonsense, Tepper said. Apologies, Kelsier went. I didn't realize that good man Tepper had been to Lord Renault's estates recently. When you dined with him last, did he tell you something that he did not tell me? Tepper's face reddened. Ska did not travel, and they certainly didn't dine with lords. You think me a fool, traveler, Tepper replied, but I know what you're doing. You're the one they call the survivor. Those scars on your arms give you away. You're a troublemaker. You travel to the plantation, stirring up discontent. You eat our food, telling your grand stories and your lies. Then you disappear and leave people like me to deal with the false hopes you give our children. Kelsier raised an eyebrow. Now, good man Tepper, he said, your worries are completely unfounded. Why, I have no intention of eating your food. I brought my own. With that, Kelsier reached over and tossed his pack onto the earth before Tepper's table. The loose bag slumped to the side, dumping an array of foods to the ground. Fine beads, fine breads, fruits, and even a few thick, cured sausages bounced free. A summer fruit rocked across the packed earthen floor and bumped lightly against Tepper's foot. The middle-aged Ska regarded the fruit with stunned eyes. That's nobleman's food, Kelsier snorted.
Barely. You know, for a man of renown, prestige, and rank, your Lord Trusty has remarkably poor taste. His pantry is an embarrassment to his noble station. Kepper paled. That's where you went this afternoon, he whispered. You went to the manor. You stole from the master. Indeed, Kelsier replied. And might I add that while your lord's taste in food is deplorable, his eye for soldiers is far more impressive. Sneaking into his manor during the day was not easy. In fact, it was quite the challenge. Kepper was still staring at the bag of food. If the taskmaster finds this here... Well, I suggest you make it disappear then, Kelsier said. I'd be willing to bet that it tastes a fair bit better than watered-down farlet soup. 24 sets of hungry eyes studied the food. If Tepper intended further arguments, he didn't make them quickly enough, for his silent pause was taken as agreement. Within a few minutes, the bag's contents had been inspected and distributed, and that pot of soup sat bubbling and ignored as the Ska feasted on a meal far more exotic. Kelsier settled back, leaning against the hovel's wooden wall and watching the people devour their food. He had spoken correctly. The pantry's offerings had been depressingly mundane, but this was a people who had been fed on nothing but soup and gruel since they were children. To them, breads and fruits were rare delicacies, usually eaten only as aging discards brought down by the house servants. Your storytelling was cut short, young man, an elderly Ska noted, hobbling over to sit on the stool beside Kelsier. Oh, I suspect there will be more time for more later, Kelsier replied. Once all evidence of my thievery has been properly devoured. Don't you want any of it? No need, the old man said. The last time I tried Lord's food, I had stomach pains for 3 days. New tastes are like new ideas, young man. The older you get, the more difficult they are for your stomach. Kelsier paused. The old man was hardly an imposing sight. His leathered skin and bald scalp made him look far more frail than they did wise. Yet he had to be stronger than he looked. Few plantation Ska lived to such ages. Many lords didn't allow it. And the frequent breeding, many lords didn't allow the elderly to remain home from daily work. And the frequent beatings that made up a Ska's life took a terrible toll on the elderly. What was your name again? Kelsier asked. Menace. Kelsier glanced back at Tepper. So, good man Menace, tell me something. Why you let him lead? Menace shrugged. When you get to be my age, you have to be very careful or you waste your energy. Some battles aren't worth fighting, simply. There was an implication in his eyes. He was referring to things greater than his own struggle with Tepper. You're satisfied with this, then? Kelsier asked, nodding toward the hovel and its half-starved, overworked occupants. You're content with a life full of beatings and endless drudgery? At least it's a life, Menace said. I know what wages malcontent and rebellion bring. The eye of the Lord Ruler and the eye of the Steel Ministry can be far more terrible than a few whippings. Men like you preach change, but I wonder, is this a battle we can really fight? You're fighting it already, good man Menace. You're just losing horribly. Kelsier shrugged. But what do I know? I'm no more than a traveling miscreant, here to eat your food and impress your youths. Menace shook his head. You jest, but Tepper might have been right. I fear your visit will bring us grief. Kelsier smiled. That's why I didn't contradict him. At least not on the troublemaker part. He paused, then smirked more broadly. In fact, I'd say calling me a troublemaker is probably the only accurate thing he has said since I got here. How do you do that? Menace asked, frowning. What? Smile so much. Oh, I'm just a happy person. Menace glanced down at Kelsier's hand. You know, I've only seen scars like those on one other person, and he was dead. His body was returned to Lord Trusting as proof his punishment had been carried out. Menace looked up at Kelsier. He'd been caught speaking of rebellion. Trusting sent him to the pits of Hathsin, where he worked until he dropped dead. The poor lad lasted less than a month. Kelsier glanced down at his hands and forearms. They burned sometimes. They still did, though he was certain the pain was only in his mind. He looked up at Menace and asked, You ask why I smile, good man Menace? Well, the Lord Ruler thinks he has claimed laughter and joy for himself. I'm disinclined to let him do so. This is one battle that doesn't take much effort to fight. Menace stared at Kelsier. For a moment, Kelsier thought the old man might smile in return. But eventually, Menace shook his head. I don't know, I just don't. The scream cut him off. It came from outside, perhaps to the north. Through the mist's distorted sounds. The people in the hovel fell silent, listening to the faint, high-pitched yells. Despite the distance in the mist, Kelsier could hear the pain contained in those screams. He burned tin. It was simple for him now, after years of practice. The tin sat with other elementic metals within his stomach, swallowed earlier, waiting for him to draw upon them. He reached inside within his mind and touched the tin, tapping powers he could still barely understand. The tin flared to life within him, burning his stomach like the sensation of a hot drink swallowed too quickly. Elementic power surged through his body, enhancing his senses. The room around him became crisp, the dull fire pits flaring to near blinding brightness. He could feel the grain in the wood of the stool beneath him. He could still taste the remnants of the loaf of bread he smacked on earlier. Most importantly, he could hear the screams with supernatural ears. Two separate people were yelling. One was an older woman. The other a younger one, perhaps a child. The younger screams were getting farther and farther away. Poor Jess, a nearby woman said. Her voice booming in Kelsier's enhanced ears. That child of hers was a curse. It's better not for Scar to have pretty daughters. Tepper nodded. Lord Trusting knew was sure to send for the girl sooner or later. We all knew it. Just knew it. Still ashamed, though, another man said. The screams continued in the distance. Burning tin, Kelsier was able to judge the direction accurately. Her voice was moving towards the Lord's manor. The sound set something off within him, and he felt his face flush with anger. Kelsier turned. Does Lord Trusting ever return? The girls, after he's finished with them. Old Menace shook his head. Lord Trusting is a law-abiding nobleman. He has the girls killed after a few weeks. He doesn't want to catch the eye of the Inquisitors. That was the Lord Ruler's command. He couldn't afford to have half-breed children running around. Children who might possess powers that Ska weren't supposed to know existed. The screams waned, but Kelsier's angers only built. The yells reminded him of other screams, a woman's screams from the past. He stood abruptly, stool toppling to the ground behind him. Careful, lad, Menace said apprehensively. Remember what I said about wasting energy. You'll never raise that rebellion of yours if you get yourself killed tonight. Kelsier glanced at the old man. Then, the screams and the pain, he forced himself to smile. I'm not here to lead a rebellion among you, good man Menace. I just want to stir up a little trouble. What good could that do? Kelsier's smile broadened. New days are coming. Survive a little longer, and you might see great happenings in the final empire. I bid you all thanks for your hospitality. With that, he pulled open the door and strode out into the night. Menace lay awake in the early hours of morning. It seemed that the older he became, the more difficult it was for him to sleep. This was particularly true when he was troubled about something, just as the traveler's failure to return to the hovel. Menace hoped that Kelsier had come to his senses and decided to move on. However, that prospect seemed unlikely. Menace had seen the fire in his eyes. It seemed such a shame that a man who had survived the pits would instead find death here on a random plantation, trying to protect a girl everyone else had given up for dead. How would Lord Trusting react? He was said to be quite harsh with anyone who interrupted his nighttime enjoyments. If Kelsier had managed to disturb the master's pleasures, Trusting might easily decide to punish the rest of his skaa by association. Eventually, the other skaa began to awake. Menace lay on the hard earth, bones aching, back complaining, muscles exhausted, trying to decide if it was worth rising. Each day he nearly gave up. Each day was a little harder. Some days he would simply stay in the hovel, waiting until the taskmaster came in to kill those who were too sickly or elderly to work. But not today. He could see too much fear in the eyes of the skaa. They knew that Kelsier's nighttime activities would bring trouble. They needed Menace. They looked to him. He needed to get up. And so he did. Once he started moving, the pains of age decreased slightly, and he was able to shuffle out of the hovel towards the fields, leaning on a younger man for support. It was then that he caught a scent in the air. "What's that?" he asked. "Do you still smell smoke?" Shum, the lad upon whom Menace leaned, sniffed the air. The remnants of the night's mist had burned away, and the red sun was rising behind the sky's usual haze of blackish clouds. "I only smell smoke lately," Shum said. "And the ash mounds are violent this year." "No," Menace said, feeling increasingly apprehensive. "This is different." He turned to the north, toward where a group of skaa were gathering. He let go of Shum, shuffling towards the group, feet kicking up dust and ash as he moved. At the center of the group of people he found Jess. Her daughter, the one they had all assumed had been taken by Lord Trusting, stood behind her. The young girl's eyes were red from lack of sleep, but he appeared unharmed. "She came back not long after they took her," the woman was explaining. "She came in and pounded on the door, crying in the mist. Flynn was sure it was a mist-wraith impersonating her, but I had to let her in. I don't care what he says, I'm not giving her up. I brought her out in the sunlight, and she didn't disappear. That proves she's not a mist-wraith." Menace stumbled back from the growing crowd. Did none of them see it? No taskmasters came to break up the group. No soldiers to make sure the morning population counts. Something was very wrong. Menace continued to the north, moving frantically toward the manor house. By the time he arrived, others had noticed the twisting line of smoke that was barely visible in the morning light. Menace wasn't the first to arrive at the edge of the short hilltop plateau, but the group made a way for him when he did. The manor house was gone. Only a blackened, smoldering scar remained. "By the Lord Ruler," Menace whispered. "What happened to here?" "He killed them all." Menace turned. The speaker was Jess's girl. She stood looking down at the fallen house, a satisfied expression on her youthful face. "They were dead when he brought me out," she said. "All of them. The soldiers, the taskmasters, the lords. dead. Even Lord Trusting and his obligators. The master had left me, going to investigate when the noises began. On the way out, I saw him laying in his own blood. Stab wounds in his chest. The man who saved me threw a torch in the building as we left. This man, Menace said. He had scars on his hands and arms reaching past the elbows? The girl nodded silently. What kind of demon was that man? One of the Ska muttered uncomfortably. Another whispered, apparently forgetting that Kelsier had gone out during the day. But he did go out into the mist, Menace thought. And how did he accomplish a feat like this? Lord Trusting kept over 24 soldiers. Did Kelsier have a hidden band of rebels, perhaps? Kelsier's words from the night before sounded in his ears. New day's coming. What of us? Tepper asked, terrified. What will happen when the Lord Ruler hears about this? He'll think that we did it. He'll send us to the pits, or maybe order his coloss to slaughter us outright. Why would that troublemaker do something like this? Doesn't he understand the damage he's done? He understands, Menace said. He warned us, Tepper. He came to stir up trouble. But why? Because he knew we'd never rebel on our own, so he gave us no choice. Tepper paled. Lord Ruler, Menace thought. I can't do this. I can barely get up in the mornings. I can't save these people. What other choice was there? Menace turned. Gather everyone, Tepper. We must flee before word of this disaster reaches the Lord Ruler. Where will we go? The caves to the east, Menace said. Travelers say there are rebel Ska hiding in them. Perhaps they will take us in. Tepper paled further. But we'd have to travel for days. Spend nights in the mist. We can do that, Menace said. Or we can stay here and die. Tepper stood frozen for a moment, and Menace thought the shock of it all might have overwhelmed him. Eventually, however, the younger man scurried off to gather the others, as commanded. Menace sighed, looking up for the trailing line of smoke, cursing the man Kelsier quietly in his mind. New days indeed. That was Vigilante Bardock reading the prologue of Mistborn, the first book in the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. Please support the official release of Brandon Sanderson's work. He is a good author. Oh, and if possible, get him to make Mistborn an anime.